And you know, if you look at the other literature, and that's again from my Slade group, all what I've just said is consistent with the international literature in recovery practice and organisational change. So the project itself, when we developed those 10 key challenges, we were asked to bid for some money by the Department of Health to run a project, and that became the ImROC project. It's actually under the Labour government we got the money, and we sort of got very anxious when we got a new government because we nearly lost it, but they decided to more or less keep the same element in their strategy. And we kept the money and we worked with the Department of Health. It was supported by the Centre for Mental Health, I think it was the Sainsbury Centre for Mental Health it was called at the time, and the Mental Health Network of the NHS Confederation. In fact, those two links with those two organisations have been very important. Particularly I think the NHS Confed, because we needed to get into working with local trusts. We had a good project team with that group of people, well supported by a project manager, and we had a group of peer trainer associates with the project. And that's more or less still carrying on with a few adjustments now, that same sort of project team. We had a methodology which is essentially that the 10 key challenges form the basis of a conversation between the project team and the trust, the organisation we were working with. Because that 10 key challenges meant they could say, well, look, you know, we'll prioritise these 3 or 4 areas in that, and we'll work on those during the couple of years of the project. We had an enormous amount of trusts wanting to be part of this project, and we really were only aiming for 6 or 8 at the beginning. We had 30 odd who applied for it. So rather than let them all down, or let a lot of them down, we sort of changed the way we were working. We'd initially wanted to work intensively with 6 or 8 trusts in a sort of consultancy way, using that methodology from the 10 key challenges. But actually we found that there was a group of trusts who we could work with in that way, 6 of them. There was a group of trusts we called demonstration sites, so we're doing a lot more in that area. So they became exemplars, if you like. And there was a whole bunch of other trusts and organisations that sort of were starting on their sort of thinking about it, but they hadn't reached the implementation stage. And with combining those with the other 2 groups, we formed a number of learning sets, 4 of them consisting of people from those trusts. It's not dissimilar for today's sort of setup. And we work with them using those. So what did we achieve? Well, there's 29 sites we delivered all those joint training sessions. The key here is we're trying to emphasise co-production between, if you like, the ImROC team and the people within the ImROC team who work peer trainers, and also getting trust to invite along with their group of 8 that they would bring to these round tables, were included service users and carers. And we supported the recruitment of over, I think, 150 peer support workers in these trusts. Many of the trusts wanted to develop recovery colleges, and those started to be developed during the project, and they're now either planned or they're already set up. And we've had some international collaborations in other countries. Important, I think, was our learning sets, really, because they, I think, in many ways were sort of quite a good engine for the groups of trusts that were involved in it. Because, of course, they all came, in a sense, with different histories, different levels of capacity, different levels of experience in this area. And of course, I remember in some of them, we'd get trusts saying, well, we're hopeless, you know, we're not doing half as much as they're doing on the other table. But of course, as time went on, I think those trusts developed their own sense of confidence, that they were able to go back and think it through in their own trust. And of course, they developed their own ideas of how to implement those 10 key challenges within their own trust. And those trusts who perhaps were at a greater stage act sometimes exemplars. You know, a lot of people would go and visit the Recovery College over at Nottingham, which we might talk about later, and so on. And of course, we ran a sort of series of different workshops on different topics. You can see the results of some of that in that publication. All these publications are all on the website, and if you want more, there's publications on all those topics. Plus, we've just recently put 2 out on carers and peer support workers. And even Norman Lamb was kind to us. He at our relaunch of ImROC, the new ImROC, he was very complimentary about what we've done. And it was nice to hear him say that, because I think no matter what I might think about many ministers in this government, Norman Lamb did actually get it. I think he fully understood what we were trying to achieve and what recovery was about. It was rather nice to hear that. And what are we doing in the future? Well, we've no more government funding, no more Department of Health funding. We've got some small funding from both the Centre for Mental Health and from the NHS Confederation, and we've got contracts around the country with a number of trusts. But again, importantly, what we will be doing is running a series of learning sets. We've got, I think, 19 trusts involved in this, and we're dividing it up into 4 learning sets with those groups. So again, those are going to be important. A lot of the trusts, when we negotiate with them, want to focus on things like developing a recovery education college, developing peer support workers. I think partly because those things they see as fairly fundamental, but also they see as very tangible as well, which has been important. Because those other components, developing the culture, is a sort of multifaceted notion, really. You don't suddenly jet the notion of a recovery-orientated culture. That has to be developed over years. But setting something up as an exemplar of that in the trust becomes very important, because it's those particularly peer support workers that start to sort of force cultural change. So what have we learned, actually? Well, I think that's probably true for most. It's, this is, for all these trusts, this is not an easy journey. There's many other things that, of course, influence our direction of travel, not least developing foundation trust status, which can be very damaging, of course. But of course, it can't go wrong every time. And if we looked at sort of, say, those 7 key principles there from Mike Slade's book, the ImROC experience of leadership is that essentially you need leadership from the top, but you also need a bottom-up approach, because leadership in these sort of things has to be at various levels. And what is also important within that leadership is developing good relationships between the trust and service users in that trust. So, service user involvement becomes very, very key, orientated really along the lines of co-production. If you want to maximise the sort of pro-recovery approach amongst your staff, involve staff in training, invite them to tell their recovery story, plan training in a co-productive way between staff and service users. If you want to develop recovery skills in the workforce, it's staff training, but also, use of peer trainers, peer support workers becomes very key to developing that. Make the roles visible. Recovery colleges are a very visible, tangible component of what we might do. And also use people's narrative accounts. This notion of sort of stories really ought to run through developing recovery orientation within trust. You need to evaluate success as well. One of the problems is there's no clear direction, no clear guidance about what recovery outcomes might be. We've just done a piece of work for the Department of Health with some suggestions for that. But, whilst I could be clear about some of those that we suggested to the Department of Health, like the use of Inspire, the questionnaire, as a means of assessing the service user experience, many other sort of recovery-orientated measures were not necessarily suitable in routine use, although there are a lot of recovery-orientated measures about. And also, final thing that one of the key principles is amplify the power of consumers. Well, you know, you're thinking of learning sets within that. That's a very good way to do it. But also thinking about not just, you know, how do you go beyond the usual confines of service user involvement? And of course, you're working in a big picture here, from, you know, national right down to local, right down to sort of staff-patient interactions. And, you know, there are a number of ways that ImROC has worked in that, but of course not on its own, with the help of other organisations. And finally, what are the conclusions we made that sort of generally might guide us? Well, firstly, everywhere's different. You know, every site we worked with was different. There's a unique history, there's a unique setup. So you've got to accept sometimes that people's progress might be a lot slower than you desire. And I think that was one of our experiences. One of the trusts who we thought it was always an exemplar, actually took the 2 years to get to where we think it should have been in the first place, but it made it. Also, really, you know, change is possible, but actually you need that leadership from the top, and you need to engage people in the development, and co-production becomes very important in that. Training, though, and I can't emphasise this enough, it's no use saying we'll train everybody, because if your organisation doesn't support what you've trained people to do, that training becomes valueless. And I think we've had enough experience of that, you know, and there's a lot of experience within the literature to tell you that. If you're training people, you need the combination of an organisation to put those people back into that will support what they've learned in that training. The other one, of course, leadership's critical, and it's always it's quite often dispersed, like this is in this way, I told you about that. I also think we need to sort of start changing our approach to risk assessment and management. And I think what you're looking at here is changing risk into a sort of a notion of safety and safety planning. That's the topic of another talk, though. But, you know, a big driver for change within our own workforce is the inclusion of people with lived experience within it. And the two specific developments that I've emphasised that people really did find useful were recovery colleges and development of peer support workers, because that moves things on at quite a pace. And, you know, in the end, I think you're left with some very serious questions here about how we evaluate moving towards a recovery orientation. Again, topic for another talk, but I do think whatever you're doing in a trust, that needs to be evaluated. And I guess that's the sort of, that came from one of the service user organisations, and I couldn't help feeling they got it right with that quote from Michelangelo. And I guess underneath, that's also the truest thing you can think, that, you know, this is about a different relationship between them and us. And, you know, I wonder who the them and us is in that statement, and we need to think about that, but it's about developing a partnership based on some sort of common humanity. So, thank you.